So thanks for the introduction. My name is Lauren Malacarney. I am a white woman with blonde hair, pulled half back, and a tan sweater with a turtleneck underneath because it's finally fall in Pittsburgh. I am a physical therapist, but kind of took on more of a research role recently with the University of Pittsburgh Model Systems for Spinal Cord Injury team.
And I'm Kristen Lobrera with the American Institutes for Research. I'm part of the Technology Solutions team here, and I am an instructional designer and e-learning developer. I am a white woman in my younger 40s, and I have shoulder length, wavy brown hair, and I'm wearing a navy top.
So our goal as a team between AIR and Pitt was to take what is a very robust manual of wheelchair skills training called the Wheelchair Skills Program, and to translate it into a more user-friendly, slightly easier to digest version of that information that could be provided directly to people who use wheelchairs and want to learn skills on their own if maybe they don't know how to do them or they haven't learned them in therapy or for some other reason. And so, in case anybody is unfamiliar, wheelchair skills really are kind of like, anything that a person who uses a wheelchair may need to do to access their environment. That might be their home or the community, wherever they need to get to. And so sometimes we can think of them in like different buckets. So, basic skills being maybe things that are a little bit more oriented toward home. So just, pushing your wheelchair or being able to turn it, folding it and unfolding it to get out of the house and those types of things. As a person tries to access the community, skills generally have to be just a little bit more advanced. And so things like obstacles come into play. And so that might be getting over a gap to get onto a bus or onto a subway, getting up and down a threshold or a curb if maybe a ramp or a curb cut isn't available. And then even getting into and out of your wheelchair in slightly more complicated ways. So maybe to a lower surface or down to the floor. And then ultimately more advanced skills. So, in more complicated terrain, doing a wheelie can be helpful. It's not just a party trick. But, being able to lift those small front wheels that sit on the front of a manual wheelchair up and off of the ground kind of stops them from getting stuck on things like, grass or gravel or whatever it may be. So those wheelie skills and things that go along with that tend to be kind of things we put more into the advanced bucket. But either way, kind of the core of it is there are these skills that are necessary to access the world. And we are trying to create a way to get that information directly into the hands of people who use wheelchairs, so anybody with a mobility disability. And so excuse me, too fast. So we're doing that partially because we know that when people who use wheelchairs are more independent with wheelchair skills, there is a trickle-down effect into a number of positive outcomes in terms of their ability to access the healthcare services that they need, independence, and a whole host of things, all positively associated with independence with wheelchair skills. But at the same time, people who use wheelchairs often identify their ability to do skills as an area of concern and generally do lack key skills that would open up all environments to them. The programs that we have are incredibly useful, but are very lengthy and they're text heavy and they're difficult to read and they kind of read at the clinical level and don't always reflect, person-centered language for people who use wheelchairs or just other things that would make it slightly easier to digest. So the goal of this project, at least I'll speak to the Pitt side and then Kristen can speak to the AIR side, but we had that big manual and we wanted to translate it, like I said, to a more usable and accessible tool for people who use wheelchairs, all the while kind of engaging the input of people with mobility disability who use wheelchairs in a number of different ways, which I'll talk about in a little while. And then to kind of create a more interactive, media forward, more content that's just kind of easier to use and self-paced and a number of other things.
And from AIR, our goal was to create a user-centered, mobile-friendly platform that people can easily navigate to find what's relevant for their goals. It was important for us to enable personalized learning paths so that they can choose the topics that they need to learn or that they want to learn, and that that the training is based on their mobility and experience level, and wheelchair type, because we cover both manual and electronic wheelchairs. And so we just wanted to make sure that the learner can get practical, meaningful guidance based on their needs, and that they're able to find them easily.
So we started with developing content, right? So on the PIT side, as the content was being, I shouldn't even say developing, because this content exists in really useful ways from a clinician standpoint. But again, trying to take that content and adapt it in a number of ways to be in a more direct to user format. And so that's when we started to engage our consumer advisory board, which was made up of 8 to 10 people with lived experience with mobility disability, some people with spinal cord injuries, other people who have had amputations, and a couple of other things too. And so they helped us to kind of decide what skills matter most. And so that was that first, that first page that I showed with all the different wheelchair skills that was informed from that group. And then also just kind of helping us with preferred language regarding, mobility and disability for things, if somebody has weakness in their arms or their hands and it changes the way they propel their wheelchair, kind of preferred language about describing that. And then also as prototype development happened, they were able to give us feedback. And again, we'll come back to that a little while later. And so with the content, we kind of took that really large wheelchair skills program and put it into more like of a user-centered different layout. And you'll see some examples of that down the line. And then really the big goal was to get more media representation and make it a more media forward version of that information. And so we filmed, my goodness, hundreds of videos of different wheelchair skills and different people doing those skills and different parts of the skill. And that's an ongoing project as we kind of identify some gaps as the training is developed.
We started, we'll talk about this a little bit more shortly, but there was an incredible amount of information. And so we started on our side at AIR with trying to figure out how to organize everything in a way that makes sense and in a way that Pitt was happy with, and the Consumer Advisory Board. So we had different iterations that we worked through, and content structures that we tried out. We actually started off developing everything in a platform called Articulate Storyline. And a couple of other people were working on this that have since left AIR. But when I took over the files that they had, I found it very hard to work in because there were over 200 slides and we didn't even have half the content in there yet. So we ended up pivoting and doing a combination of Articulate Rise, which is made by the same company, a Storyline, but it's a different format. And by doing this hybrid, and we'll talk about that a little bit more soon, but it allowed us to speed up development a little bit and just we were able to have more smaller storyline files, which made things easier for us to work on in the back end for a number of reasons. And we also created a master tutorial template, which also helped us kind of speed up the process of creating these little mini modules that cover not even that many. Each of the skills have different modules for them. So having this template helped kind of work through that development.
There's a lot of knowledge to translate, quite literally. So
Yes.
it's a big undertaking. And so next came prototype development, and this I'll kind of lean on Kristen for. So from a content knowledge and content expertise perspective, that's where we could build it out. But again, I think Kristen has alluded to how do you organize it, and what order do we put the skills in, and how do we make sure that people are safe if they're kind of accessing this independently? Is there a way we can kind of force a safety version of different modules that we had? And really kind of how do we make it a more media first interactive course. So those were questions that we punted to AIR for some help.
And we also wanted to make sure that, well, I think Lauren, you just said this, but having the safety information was really important. And the PIT team wanted to make sure that the learners were reviewing that before attempting any of the skills. And that was easier to do when we were developing in Storyline because uh, we could create it so that if someone tried to jump ahead somewhere else using the menu, they wouldn't be able to. We had all this code in the background that would make sure people had covered all the necessary pieces. It's a little less easy when we switch to Rise, but we were still able to structure things so that the safety came first, and we can sort of control to make sure that people are going through those safety pieces first. And we were also looking at, as we've said, there was so much information and this combination of all this text, videos, photos. So that was a big part of our figuring out how to do all of this. How do we package all of this together in a way that is easy to use and that people don't get lost in, because definitely our earlier iterations, it was very easy to get lost.
For sure.
So that was a challenge.
And Bonnie, I see your question about using a plain language consultant. We'll get to plain language translation here in a minute, so I'll just kind of pause on that. So really what it boiled down to in terms of the training was we broke it into, like, I guess, 3 chunks. There's this introduction piece that kind of talks about how the course is organized and orients people to the course, different tips. And then we do have some forms, and I'll talk about kind of tracking impact later, but some forms asking people to, set goals for themselves and kind of do a self-assessment of their ability to do each of the different skills to help, guide that person to select, the content that they want to cover. So the course isn't a forced start to finish. It's really meant to be kind of like self-guided. And we put in some different questions and questionnaires that allow the person to maybe focus in on the things that would be most important for them. The spotting and safety piece is a consistent throughout the course, which was like an ongoing challenge to figure out how forced to make that. And then ultimately the skill tutorials, which are the biggest lift in terms of translating all of the knowledge. And within those tutorials, we talk through a number of things regarding, adjusting wheelchairs and different wheelchair considerations specific to, how maybe your wheelchair will impact your ability to do a skill, safety again, and then the instructions plus some extra information afterward that again, we'll talk about. And so one of the other things that was really important to us was making sure that we had, broad representation of people who use their wheelchairs in a number of different ways. And so I think we have the most robust information for people who push a wheelchair with both arms. But in reality, people use their chairs in a bunch of different ways. Some people push with their feet. Some people push with one arm and one leg. Ultimately, some people maybe need assistance to do certain skills. And so our goal was to make sure that that we took this really complex manual and made it even more difficult by adding in, all of the different approaches, but with a really the broad goal of representation. And that was another piece that we really needed to lean on AIR to help with, to make sure that people could view the information that felt most applicable to them. So this is where we started, and the goal is not to be able to see what is on this slide, but the first pass translation of the Wheelchair Skills Manual kind of looks something like this, where we gave a first attempt at a plain language edit, had not thought about a plain language consultant. So this was me with content expertise attempting to take kind of a clinician-focused Wheelchair Skills Manual and translate it more into what felt more user-friendly, but we still had missed the mark, so there was more work to do. So this is what the AIR team got from us. And I'll let Kristen speak to kind of where we got to next.
Well, it's not pictured here, but we did have, we ended up moving everything into Word documents that were actually, Shoshana, who's on this call, was a big help in that. And we basically split it up by skills. So each skill had a storyboard, and um, that took some time and effort as well. We were really trying to work on that plain language edit at this point. We wanted to make sure that because so much of the language had been very, you know, it was written for clinicians, and that's very much how it came across. Um, so, among other things, we used AI, which was at times helpful and sometimes not. Um, but we then had these storyboards that we could work with to move forward. And what's on the screen here is part of the introduction, which is this part is in Rise. And as I mentioned, there was a real desire for visual breaks within the course, and so that's why you'll see here and on the next page there are we created icons to try to create more visual interest on the screen and to help ground people in where they are. You'll see on this next slide, we also we use these icons that you saw a few slides ago. We use them throughout to help people visually see if they're visual. You know, we've got the different paths for people who use both arms, people who use one arm and one leg, and people who use two legs. And then we also have another one for with assistance. So we chose Rise for this part because it's a little faster and easier to develop in, much easier to edit. You can have more people working on it at the same time. There were a number of things that kind of helped by moving this piece to Rise. And we also have this. This is, I don't know if we've actually said this, but this is still in development.
That's an
And there
important
have been
point. Yeah.
changes since some of these screenshots, but it's still a work in progress. And part of the piece in Rise is the spotting and safety section. And there are parts that are mandatory where people can't move forward without completing a section. So there'll be things that you have to click or select, and then once you get through them, then you can move on to the next piece. So that's how that works.
Work in progress is a good way to describe it. Um, the next bit was kind of past the introduction and then really like into the probably the hardest piece of this is translating the skills themselves into tutorials with media forward approaches. And so that's where Kristen mentioned the storyboards where we have, narration and on-screen text and what media goes along with them was what we were trying to collaborate on. And I don't know if Kristen has anything to add to that.
No, not really. I mean, we did again because we were trying to, one of the goals is to make this mobile friendly with the thinking that someone might be, in their wheelchair trying to work on these skills and might be using a phone or a tablet while they're working on the skills. So that was important for us. So among other things, we have to really be careful about how much text is on the screen. And Rise is, it adjusts based on what your what kind of device you're using. So it works well on mobile and desktop. But we also had to make sure that they're just, we still have to be careful about how much text is there. People won't read a whole bunch of text. They're there to learn skills, not read a novel. So we were really paying attention to that, as well as using large buttons that people can click, easily press with their fingers, or even we even considered some mobility issues of people who might have more limited hand function, making sure that you can still scroll through the content. So those were all considerations.
And Bonnie's comment is, too long did not read, less is more. And for sure, that's the goal and also the challenge of having so much information that is valuable, but finding a way to present it in like a digestible way. And so as a reminder, here are, I think these are all of the skills. There might be one missing, but these were the modules that we were trying to build out. Each of them, it has a lot of information. So where we ended up, again, we had a ton to say, right? So we went from here, all of these different things to say, and all of these different videos that we wanted to embed. And that's kind of, you saw some examples of where we started. A quick side note, we ended up grouping the skills into different skill groups. And so there are 6 different ones. And again, we can use different icons, and Kristen can speak to this to kind of orient people and to ground them to where they are in the training. It is self-paced, like I mentioned before, so people don't have to go through one to get to another. We do tend to mention when something is a bit more of a prerequisite skill, we make sure we reference that to say, hey, you might want to go check out a stationary wheelie before you try to do a moving wheelie, things like that. But again, a lot of this is still in development. But this is where we are with the skill groups. And so the tutorials, I think, one more thing. So just to fully appreciate where we started and where we're trying to go, here's an example of a video that we recorded that we needed to find a way to represent in a more learning-oriented way. So this is a person we work with whose name is Michael, and simply just showing how he propels his wheelchair with one arm and one leg. Michael has had a stroke. He's part of the group, and he's comfortable with me sharing that. And so he just simply showing this, you think it would be easy to explain in a tutorial, but there's a lot to explain to somebody who may not necessarily know exactly how to do this skill. And so we have those examples again for something like obstacles. So here's another example of kind of the unedited version of these videos. That's kind of a bad example. So we tried to keep the clips short because I think that when they become too long, number one, the content and the skill information that we're trying to portray gets lost, and so it's also a challenge to link some of the narration to the skill itself. That's actually an example of, we tried to show some examples of errors that people can make, and we'll talk about that a little while later. And so we both had to represent the right way to do things, and then kind of the way that people maybe commonly error in the skill and ways to fix it. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we just have all of this media, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of videos, and trying to find a way to build it into a learning format was where the big bulk of the work came from. And so this is, I'll let Kristen take over. This is kind of where we landed. And again, this is a work in progress. I wish we could pull up the course, but I don't think it actually works. So screenshots it is.
So this is what it looks like. This is sort of it gets cut off there, but this is what it looks like in Rise when you get to the part that's built in storyline. So that where it says in red, thresholds tutorial, and the white space, that is where the storyline course is. And so when the person using the course presses the play button, and it starts the storyline, which then they start off with this, which has branching in storyline. So this is where they choose whether they want to learn about doing the skill with both arms, with both legs, or one arm and one leg. So basically you choose the approach that's right for you. And we actually later on added to this section the with assistance, which people also have the opportunity at the end of each one of these paths. There's a question, do you want to try this with assistance? So, and you'll actually see that in a little bit. But this was why we wanted to be able to do this part in storyline, because Rise really doesn't do branching. This is again like part of the whole process of figuring out how do we want to organize this. I remember a very early conversation where we thought maybe we start the whole thing off where at the very beginning you decide, I am going to use both arms and that's all I want to see. But then I'm talking with you, Pitt, and how they wanted the content and how, people using this want to use the content. It made more sense to have this at every every step. So at this point, people are allowed to choose the path that they want for that skill, and then they can learn more about the skill. Lauren, did you want to talk about this one?
Sure. I mean, this is just, one of the examples for the threshold skill. And the goal again was to just have like the most media representation videos and pictures that we possibly could. And so there are lots of different approaches, and sometimes the courses allow for the person to kind of select different approaches within the type of propulsion pushing that they do of their chair. But ultimately, we tried to have as much, visual representation of the skills as possible, and at as many points as we possibly could. And then if we could play it, ultimately what happens next is the person gets to actually view these videos with audio narration, with plain language translation, audio narration, overlaying the video, very much just focusing on watching the skill and kind of trying to learn it by watching before we move into some different more on-screen text. And so that's what this is. Kristen, if you want to speak to it, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out also that those videos have captions as well. So there's audio and captions for all of the videos. And then this is an example where obviously there's no video or photo here, but it was hard to figure out how do we balance wanting to have written text explaining the different parts of the skills, but also having the videos, and again having everything be mobile friendly. So this was where we kind of get into the text of this is what's involved in this skill, this is what we're going to be learning, before then getting into the videos where it talks about it some more.
Yep. So we won't worry about the videos or whatnot, but again, just more examples. We have videos of people doing transfers, and then ultimately the person at the end of kind of learning how to do whatever skill independently has the option to view it with the assistance of another person. And so we also hope that the course serves as kind of a way to learn for people who are care partners, who maybe don't feel comfortable spotting a skill or helping a person up a curb. And so this both helps the person who uses a wheelchair to self-direct the people who are helping them, but then also can maybe serve as a place to learn for the people who are helping as well. I think, let's see. So we'll show a video here of ramps and inclines, and we'll talk briefly about playing language editing and kind of the review and editing process. So just another example of a video that we have here. And this is somebody going, I believe, down a ramp or down an incline.
I think if you just keep cruising.
Yeah. So this is an example of a more advanced skill. So doing a wheelie down a steeper incline. And again, the goal was to have real world examples of things. So we can pop back to the presentation. And so for something like coming down an incline, I think I'll jump ahead one or two. Hold on one second for the delay. Hold that thought. So when we reviewed and we edited and reviewed again, just an important point was this is where we really engaged our consumer advisory board. So as we finally got these, the actual skill tutorials built out, that was the most important time for us to send that on to our advisory board to be able to look and to have them provide feedback on language and on the layout and on ways that we were attempting to incorporate learning into the modules. And again, this is a big lean over onto AIR for the best ways to incorporate that feedback.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, I mean, we really did do several rounds of design for the overall structure, and looking at it now, it's like, of course, this is how we organize everything, but it took a long time to get there. And working with UPIT was really wonderful experience. Lauren is fantastic to work with, and it's been really helpful collaboration of trying to figure out how to streamline everything and make it user friendly.
So to the point of plain language editing, so you saw the video of somebody going down a steeper incline in a wheelie, which is part of the way people can do it or not. And so what you see on the left is the way that part of the skill is described in the Wheelchair Skills Program Manual. The skill is labeled as descends inclines. There's an element to the Wheelchair Skills Program that is more like how you evaluate somebody doing a skill as a clinician. And so sometimes the language reflects that. So, descends and incline. And I'm not going to read to you what it says. I'll just give you a minute to kind of glance there on the left for where we started. And then the first pass of plain language editing was kind of where we got to on the right, both to make it more succinct, but in an attempt to change the language to be plain language. But I think we still had missed the mark a little bit. So we went through another round. And so on the left is where we ended on the last slide. And ultimately, the skills were renamed to be more action oriented. So something like going down an incline instead of, descending an incline or descends inclines. And we tried to just make sure that even when we referenced parts of people's wheelchairs, that we were, referencing them in a way that was in plain language, but also we made sure we defined those things early on in the course. And so this is just, one simple example of, hundreds of lines of text that we attempted to both make more succinct and easier to follow with plain language translation. So I'll be interested. I'll make sure everybody has my contact information for if you have more expertise and ideas of ways to do that. I'm happy to hear it. So we won't show any more videos, but there's all of this content for wheelies and for the stairs, and we don't need to even show these ones here. But we got all of that. We have an idea of what we're going to do with the skills. They're still being built out. But really where we landed was, the final piece was in reflecting about the way that we were presenting the information and thinking about the way maybe somebody would learn in a clinical setting with therapists or something. We seemed to hit the mark with, the goals and different adjustments that somebody may need to make to their wheelchair and safety, all things that I would do if I was teaching somebody, in person. But then really what was kind of missing that we had a little bit of but needed to gather more was, what I would do if somebody was making an error and how I would maybe, I help them identify what the error was and different ways to approach it and different ways to practice. And so we then kind of tried to build out, this is content that didn't necessarily exist fully in the Wheelchair Skills Manual. And so we attempted to kind of capture, I think you saw it on the curb video, common errors that people make. Maybe they pop a wheelie that's too large or too small, and then have a bunch of examples of ways to practice and to fix that. Recognizing that people may not be realizing, if they're trying to do these skills on their own in a self-learning type of way, if they're not achieving their goal and not able to do the skill, they may not be able to completely and independently identify what might be going wrong. So we wanted to provide kind of like a comprehensive learning approach where people also had that information. And so that was another thing that we needed to rely on AIR for. So here's where we landed, and I'll let Kristen speak to this.
So this comes after where they learn the skill, and then they can select. This is again very learner-centered. If you would, want to see these examples, you can. You don't have to. You can pick what order you watch them in, etc. And then we've got the little icons there so people know that they're videos and they can review those common errors. They can also come back at any time and revisit these. And then we also, in addition to the common errors, also break down some of the practice tips, which, just get into a little more detail of you're really starting out, how, what are some tips to help you?
So again, kind of mirroring, like if I'm a therapist and I'm teaching somebody how to do these skills in person, mirroring what I would do, but, trying to make sure that that information is completely available to somebody trying to learn on their own. Because in reality, a number of people who learn wheelchair skills learn them on their own because a different topic of education, but therapists, we aren't the best at teaching how to do wheelchair skills. We work a lot on walking, but we don't work a lot on wheelchair skills, which is why this project is so important, to allow people another avenue to try to learn how to be independent in their wheelchair. And so this actually goes along with the question in the chat, and Nancy, I'll address it here too. So I think I touched on this before with how we're, trying to measure impact. In the beginning of the course, we use the Goal Attainment Scale and the Wheelchair Skills Test Questionnaire. That's, kind of allowing the person to direct their learning a little bit more specifically, both with their goal setting and also identifying, what specific skills they maybe are least confident in and have the most difficulty performing. They're only performed at the start of the tutorial. So the question in the chat is, do we include quizzes or knowledge checks throughout? I wish that we could. I don't. Kristen can maybe speak to this better than me, but short of being able to put it into like true learning management software where people have to log in and we can track individual progress, we can't do those things. And again, I'll give Kristen a second to give more information if needed, but we wish that we could, but the most important piece for us is that this is just publicly available. And so we have these two different forms, the Goal Attainment Scale and the Wheelchair Skills Test Questionnaire, are housed in Qualtrics. We don't ask for personal information, but we do record the results. So we get at least a little bit of data on the back end to see maybe what people are accessing the most. Kristen, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically that, I could see some value, I suppose, in doing some knowledge checks throughout, but it just, with the amount of content that we already had and everything else, that just wasn't really in the cards for this. Just with the amount, again, the amount of content, the amount of extra media and everything. Our hope is really that it's broken down so well in the videos and in the text, and then in using the practice tips and common errors, that people are able to really get the basics and the nuance of the skills.
At the end of the course, we do, or I should say at the end of every module, so every skill that there is, at the very end, there's a very short optional feedback survey that the person can submit. And it basically just asks them like, hey, you just reviewed the curb module. How relevant was it? And it asks a couple of questions, and then there's like an open-ended give us your feedback about the skill. So I think that we hope this is a living course that we can adapt as time goes on. But again, it's a beast to try to get in order. So that's it from us. I think I caught most of the questions, but I see some other ones coming in now. I don't know, Felicia, are you going to moderate, or do you want me to just answer them as I see them? Okay.
Nope, I can share some questions. We had a question up further is, have you considered VR headsets as part of the training process?
I have not, and I don't know anything about. I mean, I know about VR headsets, but that's a really interesting. I know there's a lot of research in the realm of physical therapy about VR. I don't know if it's specific to wheelchair skills training. I'm not up to that. But Kristen, do you have any?
I think that's a really interesting idea. Yeah, it's not something that we ever considered for this. We don't really have, at this point, we don't really have the tools for that.
Be a really interesting things to build, though. I maybe I'll send a message.
Great. So our next question is, could you talk more about how you recruited members for and worked with your consumer advisory board? How often did it meet? Were members compensated? And I'm adding to this question, was there any like feedback or considerations from them that you found surprising or changed your design in any way?
Yeah, so I'll take the first step at this one. So most of our consumer advisory board, again, I'm part of the model systems crew at the University of Pittsburgh, model systems for spinal cord injury. And so a number of people who work on our team are people with lived experience with spinal cord injury and wheelchair use. And so just professionally, they were part of the consumer advisory board. And we also just have kind of a broad group of people who participate in our research, and have helped to guide other projects as part of advisory boards that were easy to tap into. And I think we did cast a bit of a wider net to try to get more broad representation. Again, I'm a physical therapist, and so some people that I've worked with in the past, clinically as patients, I have ongoing professional relationships with them. And so we were able to recruit that way as well, because a number of people on our team are also still practicing therapists. And so we engaged them probably 3 or 4 times throughout the process, at least 2 times prior to the development of the courses, and then 1 major engagement when we had the first prototype in hand, which we found was kind of the most important piece. One of the big pieces of feedback, interestingly, was that the forced safety review was kind of annoying, I guess, was the bottom line to people. And so what I think we thought was going to be an essential piece, we had to go back and figure out how to make sure that we were checking the box for safety, but maybe not making it so forced. And that was a lot of collaboration with AR to figure out how to do that.
Excellent. Well, we're at time for this presentation. Be sure you do check in the chat. You're getting a lot of kudos in there. But thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks, everybody.